Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Babin. My father, Alfred Babin of the Royal Rifles of Canada, was a Hong Kong veteran, and I'm proud to honor him and his colleagues by serving on the HKVCA's board of directors and as the president. Our topic this evening is Transferred to Japan, presented by Tony Banham, and we'll get to Tony's presentation in a moment. But first, I'd like to remind our members that we are now accepting nominations to serve on our board of directors. You received an email about this a few days ago. In order to continue offering events such as this evening's and our other educational and awareness programs, we need enthusiastic and dedicated members to volunteer their time to serve on our board. Only 4 Cforce members remain alive today, and I believe we all share a common goal to ensure that once none remain, the Battle of Hong Kong and the members of Cforce are never forgotten. So please nominate yourself or someone else to serve on our board of directors. Many of you have attended previous events, so please just bear with me for a moment while I say a few words about how this presentation will work for the benefit of first-time viewers. The camera on your device is not activated and your microphone is muted. You will have the opportunity to ask questions of our speakers, both during and after their presentations. At the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon marked Q&A. If it's not there, try tapping on your screen once or moving your cursor to make it appear. When you've typed your question, tap Close to return to the presentation. At the end of the presentation, our speakers will answer the questions that you've submitted. We've also set up a Facebook page for you to discuss the presentation and to ask further questions. And I will tell you about this in more detail later. And a final note, we're recording this event and the recording will be available on the HKVCA website, www.hkvca, in a day or so. And don't hesitate to recommend to your friends and family to watch it. Now to tonight's program. In mid-1942, Japan began shipping POWs from Hong Kong to the homeland to toil as slave laborers in dockyards, mines, and factories. Thousands were shipped, including many Canadians, in so-called hell ships. And tonight's presentation is about that story. I'm very pleased to introduce Tony Banham, who's probably not a stranger to many of you. Tony has lived in Hong Kong for many years, having moved there over 30 years ago from his birthplace in England. In Hong Kong, he worked for several large software companies, and during that time developed an interest in the wartime history of Hong Kong. This interest has led him to establish a website that is considered an authoritative source for information about the Japanese attack and their occupation of Hong Kong. It's called HongKongWarDiary.com, and he has authored several books on this topic. Tony is frequently asked to assist in the production of documentaries by broadcasters in Hong Kong, Canada, the US, and the UK. He earned his PhD based on his research and writing about the evacuation of British women and children from Hong Kong to Australia in 1940. For those of you whose interest in the Japanese hell ships is whetted by Tony's talk this evening, you can delve more deeply by reading his book, The Sinking of the Lisbon Maru. Welcome, Tony, and please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mike. I assume you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, let me just sort out my screen a little bit and then get to business. Okay, here we go. Okay, well, thank you, Mike. Thank you for that introduction. When you first asked me to give a presentation to the HKVCA, I thought about it for a while and decided that probably the vast majority of your members have a good knowledge of the battle and probably a good knowledge of Sham Shui Po and North Point. And I tried to think of a topic which would be perhaps have some new content for them. And I also wanted a topic which covered the garrison as a whole. The story of Cforce, of course, is a story within a bigger story. And sometimes I think it's important to understand the bigger story so you really understand the context of the Cforce experience. So I thought I would talk about something which I've studied in some depth, particularly for a book I published 10 odd years ago, which is the set of what they call drafts of POWs from the Hong Kong POW camps to Japan. So let me see if this actually works. Okay. So I hope you can still see me okay, because I've not done this on my iMac before. I can see my slides wonderfully. I can't see anything else, but I'm going to assume you can see me. I promise you this will be the only text slide I use. I had a job for many years giving many presentations, and I soon dropped the idea of presenting text. It's much better, I think, to use images and then talk over the images. And for this talk, apart from this one image of Pearl Harbour, I have primarily chosen photographs and images which probably most people here have not seen before. Anyway,
Tony, sorry, let me interrupt you for a moment. I'm not sure we can see your slides.
Okay. Try again. Okay, all I can see at the moment is you, so maybe I have to share my slides again once.
Yeah. There we go. Okay.
Okay, let me just go to full screen. Is that okay?
Yes. That's great.
Excellent. Now I can see you again. So okay, that's
okay.
Right. Okay. So I won't recap. So this is the only text I'm using. I just wanted to set the context that the Japanese, almost from day one, were struggling in World War II. It's something we forget. Even Yamamoto realized that attacking the United States of America was a short-term policy. Once they woke up the US, then they were going to be in serious trouble. It would be a war of attrition, which even he knew they could not win. Maybe they could negotiate a surrender, a peace later on. So they had this problem from day one that they needed more men to join the armed forces in Japan. And they worked out that if they shipped POWs over to Japan to work, as Mike says, in the factories and docks and mines, then they could both solve the problem of having too many POWs, mouths to feed, and release some Japanese men to join the armed forces. So that's what this talk is going to be about. And I'm going to start with the very beginning here. This is a photograph which probably most people have not seen before. It only turned up, at least from my point of view, last year. This photograph shows the initial surrender discussion in Causeway Bay at around 6 p.m. on December the 25th, 1941. Now, for those who know the Hong Kong battle history, once it had been decided that surrender was the only option, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart of the Middlesex and Lieutenant Colonel Lamb of the Royal Engineers crossed into Japanese lines in Causeway Bay and went to the St. Paul's Hospital, a building which is still there today, which is unusual in Hong Kong, and negotiated the first step towards surrender. And this unique photograph turned up from Japanese sources, and it's really frustrating because the Allied guys, apart from one in a forage cap, have their backs to us. Now, I think I can see Stewart, I think I can see Lamb, and I think I can see an interpreter. But the wonderful thing is that if I'd received this photograph 30 years ago, I would have been by myself trying to work out who's there and what was going on. Today, that's all changed. Today, we share these photographs across a wide variety of interested people. And some of the best responses we get are actually from the local Hong Kong guys, the younger generation, who have studied not just the Allied side, but the Japanese. And they can even look at a photograph like this and have a go at identifying the Japanese people. So it's fantastic that we now have the internet, organizations like the HKVCA, and this local knowledge in Hong Kong, which today can come together and analyze fascinating photographs like this. Now, another thing that makes this photograph so interesting is if you look at the lower left, you can see tram tracks, and it's dark. Now, sundown on that particular day was at 5:47 p.m. So this is probably taken by about 7 p.m., so after the negotiations. And we don't know what they're talking about. But I love this sort of photograph because we can discuss it for hours and hopefully over time learn more and more about it. But of course, this was just a start. So after the surrender, as everybody here probably understands, the POWs were rounded up. And after about a month, they were distributed across the POW camps in Hong Kong, so that the majority of Cforce, in fact all of Cforce by the end of January, plus the Royal Navy, plus the Hong Kong Volunteer Defence Corps, were in North Point camp. And then the British POWs and the Indian POWs were in Shamshui Po. And then after a while, the Indian POWs were given their own camp near Argyle Street. And then after all the escapes, the officers were largely separated from the men, and the officers moved to their camp in Argyle Street by April 1942. So at that point, the Japanese were running 4 different POW camps in Hong Kong, plus the hospitals, plus the Stanley internment camp for civilians. It was a big and expensive operation. And they started to basically struggle, because not only were they struggling to look after the POWs, but of course the Hong Kong civil population were, according to the Japanese, all empty mouths to feed. And they had a big logistical problem. So they started the plan to ship POWs over to Japan. Now here's a photograph which again only turned up last year. For years, although we knew that the first shipment of POWs from Hong Kong to Japan took place on the 4th of September 1942 and consisted entirely of 616 British regulars, we did not know the name of the ship. A previous researcher in America had called it the Maru Shi, which simply means the 4th ship. And it was the 4th ship of, I think, 6 or 8 ships that he couldn't identify. And I had the most amazing conversations with ex-POWs, British ex-POWs, about this. And some of them insisted the ship had been called the Maru Shi because somebody had read it in this book and then told them the name, and they believed it. Lieutenant James Ford, MC of the Royal Scots, I asked him the name of the ship, and he said it was a very rude word, Maru, but he admitted he wasn't sure that was the real name. And in fact, it was Japanese researchers who finally found the right ship and provided me with this photograph last year. So a few things to say about these POWs. This was the very first shipment, and the authorities, Allied authorities in Hong Kong, were extremely concerned about the danger of sending people to mainland Japan and what they may face there. So they chose to send the toughest troops they could find. Now, you need to remember the garrison troops, the regular British troops in Hong Kong in 1941, were not new recruits. They were not hostilities-only recruits for World War II. They were pre-war regular soldiers. And the British pre-war army had all sorts of weirdos and misfits, people who joined to escape the law, people who joined under false names, people who joined to escape worse situations elsewhere. I remember one guy from the north of England telling me when he was 14 years old, he was sent down a coal mine with no training, no equipment, no health and safety. And he was so frightened that day, he was never frightened again in his entire life, even going to Japan as a POW. They were a tough bunch. Interestingly, it was the British officers who were allowed to pick the men who were sent on this ship. And for those 616, primarily they looked for men who'd been in trouble, both with the British authorities and with the Japanese. And in many cases, these were men who had refused to sign the "I will not escape" chit. As you know, in 1942, early 42, all POWs were asked at gunpoint to sign away their right to escape until the senior officers said, "You're signing under duress, it doesn't matter, go ahead and sign anyway." But some POWs said, "No, I'm not going to sign." And that included many who were sent on this ship. So they were a very tough bunch who were sent over to Japan with this first group of POWs. And this is them, or some of them, at the end of the war. Now, let me just fill in the missing 4 years there for this group of people. They had the best survival rate of all the POWs sent to Japan. The officers chose well. The officers were dead scared of them. 3 British officers were sent with them to Japan, and they went to the Tokyo camps, and initially to the Tokyo main camp, which oddly enough had a senior officer who was a Canadian. It was Leonard Burchell, Royal Canadian Air Force, the savior of Ceylon, a guy who had won accolades for flying a Catalina flying boat and then warning the British of a Japanese attack forming off Ceylon, which he had seen. He'd seen the aircraft carriers, 5 of them in the sea, and had had time just to report by radio back to Colombo saying that Ceylon is coming under attack before the Japanese shot him and his crew down. Burchell and some of his crew escaped and were taken prisoner and taken to Tokyo, treated very badly, and he became senior officer. And once Jimmy Ford and the other two officers arrived with these 616 men, they took Burchell aside and they said, if you're not careful, they will lynch you. If you don't control these men from day one, they will take over and they will kill you. And Burchell took this very seriously. Now, luckily, he was a very experienced, very tough officer himself, and he gained the respect of these guys. And he managed, or was influential in managing their survival over the next 4 years. Now, I love this photograph. This is a photograph I had in my collection for many, many years. And it was given to me by the sons of the face sticking out between the two guys waving the two flags. So look at waist level of the guy with the Union Jack and the guy with the Stars of Stripe. That's Tom Middleton, Royal Navy, who served as a soaker on HMS Tern and was one of the hard men sent to the Omori camps in Tokyo. And 2 years ago, the British Post Office issued this stamp as a first-class stamp and colorized it, and it was fantastic. And I think that Middleton's son actually got the original artwork for this. Why it's £1.63, I don't know. What they said in the UK, it was 3 pence for postage and £1.60 for storage because it's so slow, but that's just what they said. So moving on, having succeeded, as far as the Japanese were concerned, in transporting these men to the camps and having them work in Japan, they thought, okay, we'll do the same thing on a bigger scale. This time, they picked a bigger freighter, the Lisbon Maru, and they put a little bit over 1,830, again, British POWs on it. Then they took some off because they had diphtheria, they had dysentery, they had diseases of one sort or another. And when the ship sailed, it had exactly 1,816 people on board. Now, the Japanese had always used that figure. And when I wrote a book about this ship, I did not believe it. I went to the camp records and I think I found 1,824 names. But then a friend of mine in the UK and I worked together for 2 years, primarily led by my friend Steve Denton, on perfecting the list of POWs who were on this ship and checking it and rechecking it for a new memorial to be built in the UK, which was unveiled last October. And we found that indeed, as the Japanese had said, there were 1,816 men on board. And the problem, of course, with this ship is it left Hong Kong on September the 29th, 1942. It was found by the American submarine USS Grouper, USS 214, who put a torpedo through the side on the night of October the 1st. It sank on October the 2nd, and this is one of 2 known photographs of the sinking. There were 3. One of them was apparently stolen from an archive and was disappeared. I have a very poor quality picture, a photocopy of it somewhere. When the ship sank, 828 men were lost. Some, a very few, died in the holds. Many more were simply swept out to sea and perished over the next few days in their 1s and 2s and 3s, gripping onto wreckage. And I spoke to many of the survivors of this ship. It was an extraordinarily traumatic event, to the point where when the survivors were rounded up and finally taken to Japan, some of them via Shanghai because they were too sick to travel further at that time, excuse me, a further 200 perished within a couple of months of those diseases: exhaustion, exposure, lack of nutrition, malnutrition. And even after that, further men died, to the point where it was really unlucky. At the end of the war, when they were being liberated from the Japanese camps, a handful of men who had survived all that, the sinking of Lisbon Maru, the battle before that, period in Shamshui-Po, the years in Japan, were very kindly loaded by the Americans onto converted B-24 bombers to be flown from Okinawa to Manila, and 3 of those bombers crashed in a typhoon, killing survivors who'd been through all this. But those who did survive, it's sort of Darwinism. They had to be very tough mentally and physically to get through all that. And I had a real stroke of luck about 10 years ago when I was contacted by the family of a British Middlesex sergeant, Sgt Waldron, excuse me, who had kept around 50 photographs taken by the Japanese during the war of the POW work groups working in the camps, in the docks around Kobe. And each of them, luckily, had a description on the back, at least saying where the photograph was taken. They are pretty much unique. There are a fair number of photographs that have survived, taken in the camps in Japan, either between August the 15th and the end of, let's say, that month, or even after the Americans got to the camps. So essentially after the Japanese surrender. There are very few, if any, apart from this collection, which show the actual work parties working as they did at the time. So it's a fantastic, unique collection. Now, Sgt Waldron, his medals were stolen, and I was very luckily able to trace them and end up reuniting the medals with the family. And while I was doing that, oddly enough, I found it's actually quite common for families who have sold medals to claim later, I suppose out of embarrassment, that they were stolen. In Waldron's case, they were genuinely stolen. There was a police record, and I was able to find a dealer who had the medals and was kind enough to sell them back to the family at exactly the price he had paid. Fair enough, he was a businessman. That was a good result. But as I say, this collection of photographs is absolutely unique and absolutely fascinating. I chose this one simply because I think it's one of the representative ones, but there are many others which are available to see on my website. Now, having had 2 transportations, we now move on to the 3rd ship to leave Hong Kong, the Tatuta Maru. And this was the first one to include Cforce personnel. Now, in the camps, first of all, Shamshui-Po. The Japanese, having shifted 1,816 British POWs out of Shamshui-Po, now had space for Cforce to move there. So North Point was evacuated, the Canadians moved into Shamshui-Po. And by the way, I don't think it's any coincidence. I think the Japanese shipped 1,800 plus POWs out of Shamshui-Po deliberately to make space to allow them to close North Point and have one less POW camp to worry about. So they moved the Canadian POWs into Shamshui-Po, from where all the drafts left. Unfortunately, the Japanese had made a big fuss about the sinking of the Lisbon Maru, blaming the Americans. They were saying the Americans attacking the British, the Americans are killing all these men. It's not our fault, it's the Americans' fault. So they tried to turn it into propaganda. Now, obviously that was utterly unsuccessful. Even the British guys, I met many of them, in fact, who had been on the Lisbon Maru, never blamed the Americans. The Lisbon Maru was carrying a lot of Japanese troops as well as the POWs, so it was a valid war target. But that meant that the men in Shamshui-Po were fully aware of the sinking and the loss of life. And when they were put on this vessel, they would have expected the Americans to be ready and waiting at sea for them, and another torpedo to go through the side of this vessel as well. And in fact, the lower photograph there, the lower right-hand photograph, was taken, I need to check my notes here to remember, or rather make sure I get the name correct. That was taken from USS Kingfish on the 14th of October, 1942. This ship sailed from Hong Kong on the 19th of January, 1943. So they were right to be scared. The Americans were out there and looking at these ships. And in fact, this vessel was sunk by an American submarine, check again, USS Rasher, on the 8th of February, 1943. So just weeks after it successfully transported the first group of Canadians over to Japan. Now, there's something that's always bugged me. When the British were sent to Japan, roughly 100 British officers went with the men or died in the attempt on the Lisbon Maru. Many officers were lost. With Cforce, a single officer went with them, and that was John Reed of the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps. And the reason I've got this book in the middle here is that this book was released just last year. It's extremely good, and it describes the pre, during, and post-war career of John Reed very, very well. But it didn't answer this one question I had, which is, why did only one Canadian officer go with the men? And I still don't know. I don't know whether that was a British decision, a Canadian decision, or probably a Japanese decision. It's one of those little niggling things I never thought to ask. It's too late now. You know, 20, 30 years ago, I could ask many surviving officers and probably they would have had an answer, but like many things, I left it too late. So, welcome to the difficult and confusing world of Japanese POW camp names. Pretty much every Japanese POW camp on the mainland had 3 to 5 different names at different parts during different parts of the war. Excuse me. The way the camps were administered is they were under a number of regional jurisdictions. So they were Hakodate, Sendai, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Hiroshima, and Fukuoka. Those were the administrative centers. But sometimes a camp would move from one administration over the border to another. And then the camps had their formal names like Fukuoka #5B, number 5B, but that was known to most of the POWs as the Omin coal mine, which is what is illustrated here. And by the way, in case you're not familiar with the terms B and D, B means a branch camp. So part of that jurisdiction's camp group run by the army. D means a dispatched camp. Typically a dispatched camp started as a single work party going to work for a particular mine or factory or whatever. And that was run by the company under the control of the Japanese army, but distinguished from it. So branch camps and dispatch camps are rather different. Let me say a few words about the type of work parties. As we said 3 times already, the POWs worked in the docks, the mines, and the factories. The worst was the mines. And they were bad because mines are underground, there's nowhere for you to escape, there's no food to pilfer, the conditions are normally pretty bad and pretty dangerous, the work was very hard. Factories were sort of middle ground. Sometimes you would find good honchos there who would look after the men. Sometimes there was an opportunity to pilfer things. You were working indoors and away from the elements and not down a dark, dirty, cold mine. The docks were the best. Those first POWs who worked in the Kobe docks, many of them had in fact been professional dock pilferers in London and Glasgow, for example. The container ships post-war killed the docks. It was no longer possible for a man to make a dishonest living by pilfering stuff. But these guys knew how to do it. And they knew that when you found a crate of cans of salmon, you would take 1 or 2, you could conceal 1 or 2, and then you would reseal the crate so nobody knew anything was missing. When you found a sack of rice or a sack of, I don't know, flour, sugar, whatever, they knew to take a bit of sharpened bamboo, stick it through the side of the Hessian sack and pour the contents into a sock. And again, you could conceal a sock. And then going back, taking this stuff into the camp, you could either conceal it or maybe you could hand off 1 can to a Japanese guard to let you in. So they really knew what they were doing. The docks with the right men were more survivable because of that factor. I just wanted to use this slide to illustrate the variety of camps that people went to. One ship leaving Hong Kong did not necessarily mean those guys all went to one camp. This ship, the 3rd one, had Canadians, it had British regulars, it had the Hong Kong Volunteer Defence Corps, and they were spread over multiple camps. Then there was a special draft. The special draft, the Japanese, as I said, were pretty annoyed with the British in particular for all the escapes and had separated the senior officers from the men by putting them in Argyle Street. And then they decided to put all the senior officers they'd captured from all the territory they'd occupied into a special camp. So they removed all the senior officers from Sham Shui Po and Argyle Street and sent them over to Taiwan, first of all, and then later on to Manchuria. The senior officer illustrated here is Christopher Maltby, the commanding officer of the Hong Kong garrison. The photographs, the one on your left, that was taken in September 1941, shortly after Maltby had arrived in Hong Kong and shortly after he was captured. The picture on the right was taken in September 1945, shortly after Maltby was liberated from a camp in Manchuria. Now, I wanted to show you this photograph. Some accounts of the Battle of Hong Kong present the senior officers as caricatures. They don't take them seriously. They present them as being incompetent, being hopeless, being cowards, who fought from the deepest bunker or the safety of the deepest bunker they could find. That's not my experience in talking to some of these men back in the day, also reading what they wrote, talking to their families. Yes, of course, they varied in competence, they varied in courage, but generally they took their jobs very, very seriously, and none more so than General Maltby. I do not have to explain that what you can see in this photograph is the strain of 4 years of living with the loss of Hong Kong. Excuse me one second. Quite cold here in Hong Kong today. Living with the surrender of Hong Kong, the surrender of British Crown Colony for the second time in the British Empire's history, his responsibility for the men under his command, whether killed in the battle or suffering and dying as POWs, and then the personal privations he went through. So it just gives you an illustration that it's not as simple and black and white as some historians like to claim. And by the way, the shifty looking character peering over Maltby's right shoulder there is Sir Mark Young, the governor of Hong Kong, who was also at this camp. And most interestingly, perhaps, the commander of this camp turned out to be General Maltby's brother Paul, Air Vice Marshal Paul Maltby, Royal Air Force. Moving on. The next real draft of POWs was the Narumaru, which again took a mixture of Canadians and British troops over to Japan. Oh, excuse me, I think I skipped a slide there. 1 second. Let me see if I can remember how to go backwards. Here we go. Okay, so they shipped again a mixture of Canadians and British regulars over to Japan. 270 of the Canadians ended up in Niigata camp, which was not a good camp. The death rate there was quite high. It was a tough, unpleasant camp. And some Canadians and some British ended up in Oyama. This illustration here is an illustration drawn by a POW in Oyama camp. POW's name was Sawyer, Ken Sawyer, Royal Army Veterinary Corps. And I wanted to use that to illustrate the fact that Hong Kong was an isolated garrison of the British Army. Therefore, it didn't just have infantry and artillery, which you might expect. It had the veterinary corps, it had the pay corps, it had the dental corps, the educational corps, all the elements that an army needed to survive as a garrison over time. So it had every type of person you can think of, some of them very educated, some of them very professional. Sawyer was an amazing guy. I met his family a couple of years ago and they gave me all the maps he had drawn, many papers. He escaped. He was one of the earlier escapers. Actually, to be exact, he evaded. Sawyer and 3 British companions and 3 American merchant seamen decided not to surrender on Christmas Day 1941. Instead, they stole boats and they sailed off to the island of Lantau. Eventually, they split into 2 parties. Each party thought the other had been killed. In fact, one of the Americans was killed. The other 2 Americans continued their evasion successfully and escaped. The 4 British were all recaptured. The Japanese, unusually, did not get very excited about it. They captured them on January the 29th and simply brought them into the POW camp. One of those guys actually successfully escaped a bit later, Mike Jacobs of the Royal Army Medical Corps. But even before that, Sawyer had been the sole survivor of a trench near the battle box, which was hit by a mortar bomb. So amazing guys. And it just fascinates me that the only limit is my knowledge. Every time I've been able to get in contact with a family or get in contact in the old days with an ex-POW, the stories they tell and the details you find are just amazing. You know, man after man, whether it's John Reed from the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps or Ken Sawyer from the Royal Army Veterinary Corps or whatever, they have a life and a story. And researching those stories is just always absolutely eye-opening. Then we come to a bit of a mystery. The 6th draft from Hong Kong was a Soon Chong. And it's often, it's described as a Soon Chong, but when I spoke to Japanese experts and Hong Kong experts and experts back in the UK, nobody can find a ship of that nature. James Bertram, a New Zealand reporter in Hong Kong, he mentioned that it was actually a civilian vessel which had been built in Hong Kong, sunk during the fighting, then refloated. Eventually, actually this was at the end of last year, a contact at the combinedfleet.com website identified it as most likely being the Hang Cheong, which was built at Taiku Dockyard just over there. I mean, spoiler alert, I don't live on the moon. It's just a background to disguise a very messy room behind me. The Taiku Dockyard is about 1 mile to my left here. I'm actually in the middle of Hong Kong. So it was built here, sunk, refloated, renamed Kaishu Maru by the Japanese. And unusually, and in fact uniquely of all the vessels we've described, this ship survived World War II, but then was sunk almost immediately afterwards when it came across a mine. So this vessel, this primarily brought Canadians to Narumi and Oyama. Now this photograph shows the kitchen at Narumi, not terribly pleasant looking. I wanted to talk about this again because of the sources. Some of you may have known a guy called Roger Mansell, an American guy, who dedicated a lot of the last 15 to 20 years of his life, before he very sadly passed away of cancer, to documenting in great detail, and much of this is available on his website, mansell.com, the whole POW experience of the Allies as a whole, so American, Canadian, British, Australian, whatever. And very kindly, shortly before he passed away, he sent me a CD or a couple of CDs with all his documentation. And I found a set of photographs there which nobody had noticed before, as far as I know, because they were embedded in other documents. And it included a set of photographs from Narumi Camp, showing all the little details which have now been lost and forgotten. And I pulled this out and expanded it for this presentation. So this camp was not honestly one of the worst. And of course, now we're talking about much later in the war. So I have to check my notes here for the exact date. 1 second. This was 15th of December, 1943. So very late in the war. So these guys were only in the camps in Japan for a matter of a little more than a year. Then we come to the Narumaru. Now, this ship is quite often incorrectly named as the Narumaru. It turns out from the experts again, the correct pronunciation is the Narumaru. No photographs are known to exist of this ship. So the photograph I was provided here by Combined Fleets for this presentation, very kindly, is of Point Judith, which is a sister ship. And again, this one went later in the war to a single POW camp, in this case, Sendai, the Yoshima coal mine. The photograph of the coal mine entrance here, I don't know who colorized it. I've had in my collection this picture for many, many years in black and white. And then quite randomly, I found a colorized version on the web. Now this is happening more and more. Initially, when I saw it, I was a bit, I don't know, it didn't seem quite right. I suppose the contrast is just so extreme between the real photographs you know of, which are in black and white, and these new colorized versions. And then as I looked more and more at them and started to understand the algorithms used for colorization, I actually use them more and more, especially when lecturing to younger people, because they're so much more approachable. World War II did not happen in black and white. World War II happened in color. And sometimes having a color image just makes it that much more real. And it has the immediacy, which sometimes a black and white image doesn't have. So I like it now. So I'm starting to use the colorized versions more and more. I've not seen a colorized version of the lower photo there, the bottom right-hand photo. This is an example of what I said earlier, the type of photograph I mentioned earlier, where the POWs managed to organize group photographs in the camps between the Japanese surrender and the American liberation forces arriving. And fourth from the left in the back row is George Peterson, who many of you would have known. I don't offhand recognize, oh, I think that's Phil Doddridge at the back. I recognize a couple of people there, maybe. But there are sets of these photographs. A number of them have the men named. By the way, I'm always looking at that sort of thing. I update my website at the end of every month. This month, I have 3 new photographs where every man is labeled. Though those are fantastically valuable because so often I'm asked to identify people in photographs, or the sons and daughters, or these days, granddaughters and grandsons, ask me for photographs of their POW grandfather. And now I can supply them sometimes from having these photographs. So moving on. So we get to 1944. 1944 was a tough year for the POWs. It's fascinating. if you read the POW diaries, those diaries, I mean, a word about diaries. When I first started researching the Battle of Hong Kong, everybody said to me, forget it. Nobody wants to talk about it. And all the written material was burnt during the war to boil rice. And when I built my website initially in, I think, 1998, 1999, and started reaching out to people and networking, people started coming back to me. I would always ask them, did your father leave any documentation, anything at all? And they would say to me, well, yeah, we have these letters and the diary. And time again, that happened. And from the archives, you would think the diaries from POWs would be relatively rare. But it turned out that there are hundreds, and maybe originally there were even thousands of diaries surviving. Now, when I say diaries, they varied from scraps of paper with a few red letter days written on it. So a Red Cross parcel arrived. I got a letter from Mary, so-and-so died. We were bombed by the Americans, that sort of thing. So scraps of paper. And then you had what they called commonplace books or scrapbooks, where POWs would ask their friends to write a little ditty or draw a picture, just illustrate it, sign it. And then at the far end of the spectrum, the biggest diary I received was from a British officer with the Volunteer Defence Corps, Bevan Field. And his family gave me a 3-volume, 1,000-page diary. So everything from the battle through to liberation, extraordinarily valuable documents. But when you read these diaries, in 1942, they're quite long. In 1943, a bit shorter. 1944, the waiting is just getting too much. You've seen your friends die of diphtheria, dysentery, the rations of food are being cut bit by bit, you're being sent abroad to Japan, whatever. So those diaries start to get really short. 1944 was a scary year. Many POWs realized that the war was going to come to an end, and many POWs thought they probably would not survive that experience. 1944, of course, also saw the American forces rampaging into the Pacific Islands, a period of history which I find absolutely fascinating, both on a tactical level, the island hopping campaign, and the strategic level. It's so hard to understand now for our generation. In 1945, America became so dominant in world affairs and so powerful that you tend to think they must have been that powerful earlier. But that simply wasn't the case. In 1943, as late as 1943, the British had to lend the Americans the carrier HMS Victorious because the Americans were so short of ships. And then the British had to teach the Americans how to operate carriers at night, how to fight a control from carriers, how to operate close to an enemy shore, which the Royal Navy had all done in the Mediterranean. By 1944, just 1 year later, the Americans were teaching the British how to operate carriers in big forces. And the British had to suddenly create the British Pacific Fleet to go and join the Americans as very much a junior partner by the time of the Battle of Okinawa in early 1945. But as part of the island hopping campaign, this is another good illustration of what I was just saying, the Americans captured the Northern Marianas Island, and they attacked Saipan on June the 17th, 1944. At the same time, of course, just a week, 11 days earlier, they had been part of the D-Day forces. Now, despite saving Private Ryan, the D-Day forces on D-Day itself were 60% Canadian and British, 40% American. But to be able to mount that sort of attack in Europe, and then the Northern Marianas attack a few days later in Saipan, was incredible. No other country had anything like the industrial power or the military power to even consider fighting on two fronts like that. Fortunately for me, my father-in-law lived on Saipan for many years. And when our children were young, we'd often go over there. And that was before the place got developed and tourism arrived. And we took this photograph, I suppose, looking at Harry there, who's currently reading aerospace engineering at Manchester University. He's a young boy. This would have been 18 years ago, maybe a bit longer. And I very badly photoshopped the Hiroshima uranium bomb there into its original bomb pit. But it was fascinating to go there and see the point which ended World War II. Now, I'll have to speed up a little bit here, so I want to leave plenty of time for questions. When I used to regularly lecture people about the Pacific War, it didn't matter whether I was talking to school kids, university students, adults, somebody would always ask me, Should we have dropped the bomb? And it took me a while to come up with the right answer to that. And the right answer is, that's the wrong question. If you want to learn something about history, excuse me 1 second. So it is a little bit cold and humid here in Hong Kong today. If you want to learn something about history, why not ask, why did President Harry Truman drop the bomb? That transforms the question. Because what I think is totally irrelevant. I'm sitting here safe in 2022 in my little house in Hong Kong. I don't have responsibility for thousands or millions of lives. What does it matter what I think? What mattered was what Harry Truman thought. And to fully understand Harry Truman and his decision-making process, you need to understand, what did he know? What was he trying to do? What was his sum total experience at that time? And what did he have available to him? If you understand those 4 things, that's history. And when somebody asks me, define history, I say, history is the story of human decision-making. You need to understand why people did things. And if you can really answer those 4 questions completely and honestly, you are a historian. So the question is not, should we have dropped the bomb? The question is, why did Harry Truman drop the bomb? And once you take that thought process, you can start to come up with answers. Whether they're right or wrong, we can debate that until the end of time. What I would say is that there is every evidence that Harry Truman took the decision because he thought it would save lives, American lives. That was his job. It also saved Canadian lives, British lives. My father joined HMS Victorious in 1946. My mother always said, had the bomb not been dropped, he would have been with the British fleet off the Japanese homelands with the kamikazes and so forth. Well, we were saved all that, fortunately. Then came liberation. This, to my mind, and by the way, it's my last slide, this, to my mind, is the greatest untold story of World War II, and it's not about war. When it came to the recovery of Allied prisoners of war and internees, it was an incredible operation, and again led by the Americans. So the Americans arrived off the coast of Japan, expecting to have to fight their way in. On Saipan, where that last photograph was taken, actually the last photograph was taken in Tinian next door, the Americans were planning to build 4,000 bed hospitals to take just a percentage of their casualties. They made 500,000 Purple Heart wound tokens, wound badges for the casualties they expected. And the forces they amassed, which were going to crash into Japan and face dedicated suicidal resistance, suddenly didn't have a job to do, except liberate POWs. And they did that with the most amazing combination of confidence, competence, compassion. They swarmed into Japan, they found the camps. Initially, they dropped food and medicine and supplies into the camps from the air, from the carriers. And I think that's Narumi Camp, top left-hand corner, where they're saying, thanks, Lex, which of course is USS Lexington, saying they want cigarettes. And that's what the Americans did. They dropped things into the camp, food, cigarettes, clothing. As I mentioned, that photograph below it is of the B-24 called Ginny, one of the 3 which crashed carrying British and Australian POWs, which was a terrible end to the war for their families. The bottom photo shows HMS Ruler, a British carrier which was used to bring the Hong Kong Volunteer Defence Corps guys back. And I used to know many of the people in that photograph from Japan to Hong Kong. And the 2 other photographs were given to me by an ex-Royal Scots soldier called Dennis Morley, survivor of the Lisbon Maru, who, like almost all the British POWs, was transported back to the UK via the West Coast and through Canada. And everywhere they stopped, it was by train obviously, everywhere they stopped, people would welcome them with cups of tea and gifts and these little cards saying, welcome to Canada. People would take them into their homes, show them around, feed them. They never forgot the incredible hospitality and kindness across Canada, from the west to the east. And they got to the East Coast and were put on ships and taken back to the UK. And that was a shock because the ships had very little in terms of provisions and tended to feed them rice, which was not terribly thoughtful. And of course, they got back to the UK, and the UK was under very, very severe rationing and being badly bombed during the war. One of them, I think it was on the Elizabeth, the lineup, wrote on with chalk on the wall, British POWs captured Hong Kong, December 1941, freed by the Americans, September 1945, recaptured by the British, October 1945. which is, I think, summed up their feelings very, very well. And Mike, I think I'll leave it at that. I've taken a little bit longer than I expected, but hopefully we have a bit of time for questions.
Well, Tony, thank you very much. That was amazing. Lots of certainly very interesting information. I know my own father, Alfred Babin, was one of the ones who wound up in Niigata, which, as you said, was a terrible experience. And I'm sure lots of other people listening tonight had similar situations with their fathers or their grandfathers. Now, we do have some questions here, which I'd like to pass along to you. First of all, if you go back, I think it was the picture from Sendai Camp, where you pointed out George Peterson. Alison Griffith says, I believe Morris Peterson is standing on the far left.
Okay. 4
people away from George. So one more you can add to your list of names. Thank you, Elson. A question from David. He says, Tony, in Europe, there are countries that have preserved buildings and camps that were used for wartime events as a memorial for tourists and citizens to remember a lot of the tragedies that took place during World War II. Has Japan preserved any of these buildings, camps, and locations for their own citizens to see what took place in mainland Japan with these prisoners, much like they've done with Hiroshima?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Japan, not to the best of my knowledge. Obviously, we have the Yokohama Commonwealth War Graves cemetery there. And as you said, Mike, they have preserved things like the dome in Hiroshima, but that's a very Japanese-oriented view of World War II. So I would say on the negative side, no, to the best of my knowledge, they've not deliberately preserved any of these camps. Most of them have been completely built over. If you go to the mansell.com website, Wes Inyard has actually put lots of photographs of the current locations there, so you can see, but nothing, as far as I recall, has been deliberately preserved from those camps. In Taiwan, a little bit has been preserved. In Hong Kong, preservation is probably not quite the right word. There are traces still visible. That's probably as much as you can say. On the positive side, there are far more people in Japan today who are willing to investigate the period and research it and help people like me and actually accept visitors as well. So the time when Japan appeared to reject this time of their history, of course, there are still some political elements who do that, but the ordinary people are becoming much more open to discussing and researching the period, which I think is a very good thing. When Dennis Morley, who I mentioned earlier, ex-Royal Scot, when I started working with him on his wartime history, all the nightmares came back. And at one point he said to me, Tony, I wish you'd never contacted me. Then eventually he went back to Japan with his daughter and granddaughter. And he reported back to me then that he really liked the younger generation because they were interested and they were open. He hated the older generation, but he was very open to the younger generation.
All right. Fraser says that the medical officer in HMCS Prince Robert in September of '45 was surprised at A, what good shape the remaining Hong Kong POWs were in, and B, the Japanese really fed the POWs the same food they got, which seemed to the POWs to be semi-starving food, he says. So he wants to know, are some of the complaints, are they overstressed? Have they been overstated?
Okay, as usual, the truth is somewhere between the extremes. I did have the experience once of showing a photograph of Hong Kong POWs to family members of British and Australian POWs who'd been on the railway, the Burma-Thailand Railway, and they would not believe that the photographs I was showing of them were truly Japanese POWs, because there's no doubt about it, the Burma Railway was, in general, far, far worse. People were skeletal there, to the point where they ended up the war weighing 50 pounds or less. That did happen with the Hong Kong POWs. If you had both malnutrition and were wounded during the fighting or had some medical complaint. But it was no fun and games. There were periods during the war where the food ration was way below what we would consider to be normal if you're not working, and yet they were asked to work as well. Combine that with the diseases they had and the bad conditions and cold weather in Japan, People died of pneumonia, malnutrition, all the lack of the vitaminosis diseases, lack of vitamins. We are somewhat a bit biased because most of the photographs we see today were taken after the Americans got to the camps. They had been dropping food in, and the POWs who survived in 1945, they were not wallflowers. As soon as the Japanese surrendered, they broke out of camps and started feeding themselves and getting food. And most of them, luckily for the Japanese, understood that the Japanese civilians had also been under severe privation. And they did actually, believe it or not, POWs shared the food they found often with the civilians outside the camps. So the photographs you see are of men who had been fattening themselves up as much as they could for 2 to 4 weeks after the Japanese surrender. Having said that, there are photographs in the British archives of some of the more seriously ill POWs from Hong Kong, who are, again, skeletal, just like the guys who are on the Burma Railway.
Okay. Jerry says, I noticed from Vince Lapata's list of the camp rosters that there is always an even number of Winnipeg Grenadiers and Royal Rifles assigned to the Hell ships, and then eventually into the various camps. Was that something done deliberately? And if so, who decided that?
A really good question, which I cannot answer, unfortunately. If only I knew then what I don't know now, I would have been able to ask the right questions. So the only person I discussed the allocation of drafts with was Jimmy Ford from the Royal Scots, whose brother Douglas Ford was executed by the Japanese and awarded the George Cross. And he told me that for the first drafts, the British officers chose the men. I assume the Canadian officers would have chosen the men, and that would explain the equal split between the Grenadiers and the Rifles. But I honestly don't know for certain.
Okay. Another question from Jerry. Were there any vessels which had Cforce, Canadian Cforce members on them that were sunk, either by friendly fire or by enemy fire?
Yes, I believe all of them, except one which sank of its own accord. One of the vessels, I've forgotten its name, which broke down on the way to Taiwan. That, I believe, just sank by itself. The others, aside from the one I mentioned, which hit a mine after the war, were all sunk by the end of the war by the American submarines. But that's actually a very illustrative point. One of the reasons why food was so short in Hong Kong, in the Hong Kong camps by the end of the war, was that the American war of attrition, or the American-led war of attrition against Japan, had been so effective, and they were able to cut the Japanese off from their supplies. A couple of years ago, I wrote a paper in Hong Kong about civilian fatalities in Hong Kong, and the Japanese could not get enough food into Hong Kong, and honestly didn't want to waste the food they could get on Hong Kong civilians. So they started pushing them against their will very often into mainland China. And I was able to calculate that something like, the numbers are uncertain, but something like 330,000 Hong Kong Chinese civilians perished during World War II because of the lack of food and being kicked out. So you can look at almost any named Japanese vessel, whether it's a cargo ship or a transport ship or a Imperial Japanese Navy ship. And by the end of World War II, it was already at the bottom of the Pacific.
Okay. And just on your point about the civilian casualties in Hong Kong, over 300,000 of a population of how many?
The population was bloated by refugees escaping the fighting in China. So by the middle of 1941, it was 1.6 million people living in Hong Kong. By the time the British recaptured Hong Kong at the end of August 1945, the number of people living here had dropped to slightly below 500,000. So 1.1 million people had either perished or moved back to China or into Macau. And a lot of my work was separating them into those groups, who escaped into China deliberately, hoping they could go back to their ancestral village and at least find food there, who had moved into Macau, who just disappeared and who died of disease and starvation, both in Hong Kong and having been shipped against their will in the last couple of years, at least, of the war to China. So it's a pretty high percentage. Yeah. And sadly, it's something I've been discussing locally. Sadly, there's no real memorial to those people. In Singapore, some 55,000 or odd civilians perished. There's a big, tall memorial you've probably seen, Mike, in the middle of Singapore. We've not done that in Hong Kong yet, and I think it's probably time we did.
Okay, amazing numbers. Another question from Jerry: were all of the POWs boarding the ships photographed before leaving Hong Kong?
Oh, another good question. I believe they were, but we've never found the motherlode. It's one of these frustrating things. Japanese record keeping, and I've discovered this bit by bit. I'd always assumed record keeping was rubbish. It's not. The record keeping during World War II of POWs, which you would think would be very low on the spectrum of importance, was excellent. And every now and then we find these individual photographs, and actually particularly of Cforce, more of Cforce than the British regulars or the Indians or the volunteers.
Well, the Canadians are more photogenic, that's why.
It's probably true. But the ones I mean, the little sort of passport-sized photographs with the guy's name at the bottom, I have them for probably, I don't know, 40 or 50 of Cforce, and I don't think I have any for the British regulars. But I believe that they were all photographed. What we do have is the POW index cards, and we have them for the great majority of POWs, which do have a lot of information. It's in Japanese, but there are plenty of people willing to help with interpretation. But they do have a lot of information, and I suspect that originally each index card was paired with a photograph. But as I say, we've never found that motherlode of photographs.
Okay.
I'm sure they're there somewhere.
Okay, not a question, but a comment from Martin. A heartfelt thank you to Tony for a wonderful presentation. And let me ask now, are there any more questions? That's all of the questions that have been submitted so far. If you do have a question, please type it right now. While you're typing, just let me give a little plug for our next presentation. It won't be next month. There will not be a presentation like this one in February, but in March we will have an event, which will be Monday, March 21st. We'll have two very interesting speakers, one in Hong Kong and the other in Montreal, who will speak about the internment internment by the Japanese of the civilians, including Canadians, in Hong Kong from 1941 to 1945. And you'll receive an invitation for that presentation in early March. So I don't see any more questions, Tony. Shirley Cheng says thank you, Tony, and I say thank you, Tony, on behalf of all of the people who participated this evening. Thank you very much for spending your time with us from Hong Kong, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And I hope everybody out there, thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you found this event and the others that we run to be contributing to the HKVCA's mission of educating Canadians and others on the Battle of Hong Kong. So thank you very much for joining us. And
thank you.
Bye-bye.